Okay, so thanks everyone for joining the second Research to Practice webinar. For those who don't know me, I'm Ryan Jones, Rugby Development Manager with Rugby Ontario. The purpose of this series is to bring the great work that's being done in academia into the rugby community, and to encourage evidence-informed programming and structures at clubs, recognizing that we can't be on the field right now. But we can help to shape the environment for when we get back. So a couple housekeeping items before we get into it. Everyone will be on mute for the duration of the webinar. We have Amanda here presenting some of her research. And if you have any questions, just type them into the chat function in Zoom, and I'll do my best to answer those questions as I can. So now I'm really excited to introduce Amanda Visek as sports scientist and associate professor at George Washington University. She's worked with athletes from youth to college level, and her research has explored what makes sport fun for kids. And she's developed Fun Maps, which is the scientific blueprints for the fun integration theory. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Amanda, and we'll get into it.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. Thanks everyone for being here this afternoon or this morning, depending upon what time zone you're in. So Ryan asked me to give a webinar today to sort of talk about why kids play and the science behind that, and sort of juxtapose what we know from the data so far in terms of how that relates to high performance versus community sport and how that might apply in the rugby community. So I think just to start, anytime we talk about fun, this three-letter word, right? It's a small three-letter word, but it has such profound responses and reactions on the part of people, all of us in the sport community, whether we are administrators, we're sports scientists, we are coaches, parents, and even athletes. And so one of the things that I find that happens all the time, and I think when you all start to sort of reflect on how this word is used in our daily language and vernacular, that it's a word that's often sort of thrown around very loosely, right? And most sport organizations and clubs will purport, or it will be in their mission statement, that their programs offer a very fun experience for young athletes. At the same time, it's this word that's kind of thrown around very haphazardly, and is sometimes, as one coach sort of put it to me before, was that it's kind of used as like a throwaway word, right? So it gets thrown around in lots of different ways, and it elicits different types of responses. And so there are many of us in the sports space that when we talk about fun, we really see the true value in it. And we understand the significance that it plays in the sport experiences and the sport development of young athletes. And so we see it as something that's really to be celebrated, right? And integral to everything that we do. The flip side is that on the part of some of us, it also elicits this response of fear, right? That if our programs are fun, or we intentionally try and make them fun, that somehow that is not synonymous with athlete development and high performance sport. And so very often what you'll hear said is that, you know, if you want to have fun, go play community sport, go play on the rec league, right? But if you really want to truly develop as an athlete, then you're going to play high performance, highly select travel teams. So, but when we look at the research that we have to date, we know that fun is such a significant part of young athletes' sport experiences. And not only is it the #1 reason why they play and they stay in the game, lack of fun or the absence of it is the #1 reason why they drop out. And very often when we talk about fun, we tend to talk about it in terms of recreational sport. We tend to talk about it in regard to youth sport, right? And so unfortunately, there hasn't been quite enough, I think, attention drawn to some of the literature and the research that we have that's come out of high performance sport. So there was a study that was done a number of years ago by the USOPC, and they asked athletes over the span, of 2 different competitive quadrenniums, right? And they asked these high performing Olympic athletes, number one, what propelled you to engage in sport as a child, right? So what got you involved and why did you play? And fun was always among the top responses. When they were asked thereafter, well, what motivated you to actually pursue your sport at the highest level possible? And again, fun was right there near the top. So it has this very significant value when we talk about its role within athletic development. And that's part of what I want to share with you today through the data that we have. So many of you might be very familiar or somewhat introduced to this concept of physical literacy, right? And when we talk about physical literacy, we're talking about providing young athletes with a movement competence, right? So whether that's in rugby or other types of sports that they may sample throughout their childhood and adolescence. But within that movement competence, we're talking about also providing them with the environment that fosters their confidence and their motivation. And the idea behind physical literacy is that if we can provide movement competence, confidence, and motivation, then we can give our young athletes basically the skills that they need in order to be active for life, no matter what that sport may be. There's lots of different sport models that are out there, right? So whether we look at sport participation from the lens of physical literacy, or we look at it in terms of there's the 4 C's model, or the 5 C's now, I think it is too, which also talks about the role of connection and character in sport experiences, right? So if we throw all of these sort of into the cyclical cycle, movement, competence, confidence, motivation, connection, character, and this idea that we want to provide sport experiences for our young athletes that will lead to long-term athlete development, very much people will say, okay, well, sport is powered by physical literacy if we can do this. But how do you actually start to foster these big circles that you see here, right? How do we give children the movement competence? How do we instill confidence in them? How do we motivate them? How do we actually, as coaches, what are the actions and behaviors that we can do that's going to foster connection and character, right? So I would argue that physical literacy, or sport in and of itself, is actually powered by providing a fun and engaging sport experience for children. And so what we wanted to do was really try and distill, what does that actually mean and what does that look like? So whether we're talking about movement competence, confidence, motivation, connection, character, physical literacy, whatever it is, right? The other angle that we come at sport from when we talk as administrators, as coaches, as scientists, very often is this concept of the 3 Ps, which you've seen before as well, right? So very often we think about our goal as being participation, right? Or long-term participation, that we want to keep kids engaged in rugby for as long as possible. The other is that we want to foster high performance and or personal development. And unfortunately, these 3 Ps, these 3 concepts are often seen as mutually exclusive, if you will, right? Rather than interdependent. And based upon the science that we've conducted so far in studying fun, I can say with confidence that if we can provide more enjoyable, fun sport experiences for our young athletes, we can actually tick the box on participation, high performance, and personal development concurrently at the same time. The question then is, how do we actually do that? What are the tools and the strategies that we can use to achieve those goals? And that's where the fun maps come into play here. So what I'm going to do next is sort of take you through how to navigate these maps and how these maps came together, and then we can talk a bit about its application to coaching and best practices as well. So in constructing or coming up with this, I guess, research question and hypothesis is this idea of what is fun, right? So as a sports scientist and athlete myself, when you look at the literature, right, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that shows us that fun is the #1 determinant of what keeps kids engaged in sport. Lack of, or the absence of fun, is the #1 reason why they drop out. But beyond that, we didn't really know much more, right? And there's this sentiment among coaches and all of us in the sports space, these conceptions that, well, what is fun for one kid is different than what is fun for another, right? And then how do you actually distill and break down what are all of the different components, what are all of the different things that make sport fun for kids? So what I sought to do was to use this highly rigorous but yet very translatable research methodology that's called concept mapping. And it's a form of what we call action research. So we collect this really rigorous data and we engage participants, that being players, coaches, and parents, into essentially developing this visual framework, i.e. mapping fun, right? So when we did that, concept mapping is broken down into 3 very distinct phases: brainstorming, sorting, and rating. So what we did is we went into the community and we worked with young athletes and we asked them to brainstorm all the things that make playing sports fun and to list as many different ideas as they possibly could. We also asked parents and coaches to do the exact same thing. So you can imagine in working with, I think we had somewhere around 141 players, 30 parents, 50 coaches, something like that, right? So you're looking at about a sample size of about 200. And you think about each one of them individually, identifying all the things that make playing sports fun. You're going to come up with thousands of different ideas, right? So when they did that, it looked a little bit like this, right? So you take all of those different ideas, and what we did is then analyze all of these different determinants of fun. And so when we looked at that, what we were able to identify is that there were 81 specific actions and behaviors that were unique, right? So in doing that, we took all of that data, these 81 determinants, and we went back to those players and those coaches and those parents, and we asked them to sort all of those ideas in a way that made sense to them. After they sorted, we then asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how important each of these 81 things are, right? If there are 81 specific fun determinants, they can't all be equally important. So we asked them to help decipher for us what is most important from what is least important to them. So essentially what happens is we take all of this data and we apply these very sophisticated analyses on top of it, and we're able to produce these very simple visual frameworks that are called fun maps. And so I'm just going to quickly walk you through those here. So right here, what we have is what's called a point map, right? So remember the children, the young athletes, the parents, and the coaches, they brainstormed. One thing that makes playing sports fun for players is And we had all of those ideas that were distilled down into 81 specific fun determinants. This point map here is a representation of how all of those ideas were sorted together. So each point on the map, its placement on the map is dependent upon how often or how few it was sorted with the ideas nearby. So to help kind of juxtapose this a little bit, you can see that point 40, 49, and 57, partner in small group drills, scrimmaging, and then doing lots of variety within those drills, are at the bottom of the map. You can juxtapose that, right? So if you take point 57, which we just saw, doing lots of different drills and activities, with keeping a positive attitude up on the right, and then having people cheer at the game up on the left, right? So that means that these 3 points were sorted together less often. So where on the map you see points that are very close to one another, that tells us that more young athletes, parents, and coaches sorted these ideas together. What happens then is we apply other analyses on top of this, and we're able to partition each of these data points into very distinct clusters or piles that you see here. So this is a visual representation when you take those 81 fun determinants of what, when we asked parents, coaches, and players to sort, what their sorting piles generally look like. We also asked them, as they were sorting, to name each of their piles in their own words, right? So you tell us what this pile of 5 ideas is, what this pile of 6 ideas is. And when we did that, what we saw emerge was a very distinct sort of 4 sources of fun, right? So we had everything that had to do with the determinants of games and practices that are here centrally located on the map. Then over on the right, we have mental bonuses, trying hard, and learning and improving. Up near the top, we have all the social aspects of fun, from team rituals, team friendships, to positive team dynamics. And then rounding out on the west end of the map here are all of the components that are external to the player. So swag, game time support, and positive coaching, right? So one way to sort of think about this really is that this is essentially an aerial view of what fun looks like inside the mind of a young athlete, right? So when they say that they want to have fun, these are the things that they are looking for. These 11 sort of what we call fun factors, right? Which are composed of those 81 fun determinants. And so remember, the third activity that we asked them to do after brainstorming, sorting, and then rating was to rate, rather. So they rated on a scale of 1 to 5, from less importance to greater importance. And we're able to then take that quantitative data and overlay it onto these piles in a way that communicates to us which of these are most important to least important for young athletes. So piles that have a greater number of layers are greater in importance, right? So we can look at this fun map here and very easily see that trying hard, positive team dynamics, and positive coaching are the 3 most important fun factors, right? They're the piles that have the greatest number of layers. And then we can also very easily see on the flip side, those factors, those clusters that are least important, right? Which are swag and team rituals. So this gives us sort of this navigational blueprint in terms of there are 81 fun determinants. Young athletes have organized this for us conceptually into 11 piles or factors. And now we have sort of directional indicators for what is most important and what is less important for them here. So just like you can do on any type of map these days, right? Whether you're using Google Maps or Waze or whatever the navigational device is, we can zoom in and we can zoom out, right? So if you kind of take this as a metaphor for zooming out, this is the aerial view of what fun looks like in the landscape of sport for young athletes. We can zoom in. So if we zoom in on positive coaching here, and we look at all the data points, we can very easily see that young athletes, when they're talking about what makes sport fun for them in terms of positive coaching, they're looking for a coach that is very encouraging, is a positive role model, is able to give very clear, consistent communication, so there's not a lot of ambiguity about what's expected. They have high knowledge of the sport. They talk about having a coach that allows mistakes and remains positive and encouraging. Listening, someone that's easy to approach, that they can talk to, and even a coach that is able to sort of get in the mix and participate with them in some form or fashion within the practice environment as well. So when we think about these 81 fun determinants, right? And we've looked at this data in lots of different ways. So these are the abstracts of the 3 papers, the scientific papers that have come out over the last few years. One of the things that I am very interested in doing is making science as consumable and translatable as possible, right? So I think fundamentally it's important to understand how the maps came together, right? And there's lots of different ways that we can look at the data in this way, and I'm happy to share with anyone on the call here any of these scientific papers. But from a real world standpoint, you want things that you can sort of put in your back pocket, that you have at your fingertips, right? So there are all these maps, there's 81 determinants. What do I do with all of this? So what we were able to do is we took the original paper that came out in 2015 and then the most recent paper that's come out just this month. So those are the 2 that are asterisked here on the left side of the screen that you see, and developed an infographic that takes all of the scientific research and distills it into one visual framework. So that's what you see here. So to help you just sort of understand how to read this infographic, we have up at the top the sentence stem by which all this data was generated, right? One thing that makes playing sport fun for players is. Then we have the 11 fun factors, so everything from trying hard, positive team dynamics, positive coaching, and so on, all the way to swag, right, which was rated the least important, and trying hard, the most important. So the fun factors are listed in order of importance from most important to least. And then those 81 fun determinants that are organized within these 11 fun factors are also listed here for you in order of most important to least important. So this helps give us just a very quick visual representation of all of this data in a way that's easy to consume, right? So this particular infographic, if you guys are on Twitter, is pinned up at the top of my page, so it's very easy for you to grab and download, as is the access to the 2015 paper, which I'll share more of those findings as well, which is free to download. So again, I think going back to what I had said previously in terms of my goals as a scientist practitioner is to do the hard science and then to put this in a consumable, digestible way that people can use. So in addition to the infographic, which I think can be really helpful, another way to think about this, because even this can be a bit overwhelming, right? This is lots of different data points. in actions and behaviors. So when I look at this, one of the things that I glean away from it is how brilliant children are, young athletes are at telling us all of the things that make it fun. And this is truly significant when we think about the role that fun plays. So if we know that it's the #1 determinant of why kids play, and the #1 reason why they drop out, then these are the things that we really, as coaches, as parents, as league administrators, need to draw attention to. And when we do that, when we study the fun maps in these 81 specific fun determinants, then essentially what children are telling us, what our young athletes are telling us, is that fun is synonymous with athlete development. It's not goofing off and playing around and not being on task, right? If you look at all of these 81 fun determinants, they're very specific actions and behaviors that we can promote, that we can foster and act on to create these moment-to-moment experiences that are fun, that are then synonymous with athlete development, right? So if you look at just everything that's in the first factor, trying hard, playing well, kids always talk about when it comes to fun, they want to be moving, right? They don't want to be standing in lines waiting to do a drill. As much activity as possible. Setting and achieving their goals. When we talk about positive team dynamics, it's being able to work together to support one another, playing well together, and then all the aspects of positive coaching. And so when we really examine these things, they're so interrelated. And if we go back to who has the greatest influence when we're talking about working with young athletes on the field, it's the coach, right? And so positive coaching being one of the 4 most important factors here, you are then able as a coach to create these positive team dynamics, this type of environment that fosters trying hard. So fundamentally behind movement competence, right, in the sport of rugby, by doing all of these different things, we are then fostering confidence, motivation, connection, character, right? And all of these things lead back to athlete development. So another way to sort of conceptualize this in a visual way that I think is highly digestible as well, is to think about fun as fundamentally development, right? So that's why I have development asterisk here up at the top. So if we start with that as our ultimate goal in mind, is athlete development, then we know from all of the science behind the fun maps that fun is a highly physical experience for young athletes. It's very kinesthetic. It's lots of touches on the ball. It's being active and working and moving. It's getting playing time. It's competing. That's how young athletes are essentially defining what the physical aspects of fun are. Second, fun is also a highly verbal experience for young athletes on the field as well. So we're talking about providing positive feedback and encouragement, giving very clear communication, using guided discovery coaching techniques, right? So rather than just always directing an athlete and telling them what to do, questioning, getting them to think critically, increasing their rugby IQ, their game IQ, and having refs that make consistent calls is always a bonus. Third, fun is also a highly emotional experience, right? And how do we provide that for young athletes? Part of that is as coaches and as parents, being active listeners, right? Creating psychologically, emotionally safe environments for athletes to train and to compete in. And so what does this really mean when they talk about this? From both the research that we've done on the fun maps and then also a lot of the research that we're doing internationally in Sweden, when young athletes talk about this idea, this concept that they want to be able to make mistakes, that mistakes are allowable and that the coach is still going to be positive and encouraging. They're talking about this environment where they feel psychologically and emotionally safe to try new things, to be creative, to take a chance. And that might lead to failure, but they learn a lot through those failures and those mistakes. And that's what ultimately makes them better athletes and enhances their learning and improving, which is that number 4, the fourth fun factor. So again, active listening, psychological emotional safety, building players' confidence is a highly emotional, fun experience. It's also very much a social experience, right? So if we examine the fun maps, we know that 3 of those fun factors are related to the social aspects. And how do we do that, right? It's facilitating a supportive environment, right, that creates positive team dynamics. Other ways in which we communicate in nonverbal ways, but that's highly interactive and social, the young athletes are talking about makes sport fun. High-fiving, fist bumping, hugging, cheering, that's a part of it, and that also creates that supportive team camaraderie as well. Doing things outside of the sport together creates that connection, that sense of belonging, and that socially enriching experience for young athletes. And then rounding out the other end here is the environment, right? So when we think about what types of environments that we construct, having well-organized practices, doing more small-sided games and drills, not standing in line, waiting their turn to do something, right? So being very creative in the ways in which we use the space that we have on the field to keep kids moving. So again, thinking back up to all the physical aspects here, 1, 2, and 3. Keeping them moving, giving them playing time, more touches on the ball, right? And how we organize those experiences create the most fun experience for young athletes. Having a good field, playing conditions, obviously that contributes, as well as in the competition when we talk about matches, playing against teams that are evenly matched. Right? That's one of the big things that the young athletes talk about, is that they want to be challenged, they want to compete, they want to really sort of battle on the field. And they do that and they become better athletes individually and collectively as a team when they play against evenly matched teams. So this is another way that we can sort of conceptualize fun based upon these sort of 6 different dimensions, having physical, verbal, emotional, social, and environmental behind this idea that fun is actually development. So this is just another framework to sort of look at this from. The other thing that I just want to share very quickly here is when it comes to talking about fun, inevitably people want to know, well, how are kids different? How are young athletes different, right? So when we talk about high performance sport, how is that different from community sport? Because what's fun for them has to be different than what's fun for the other group. Girls must fundamentally be different than boys when it comes to what drives fun for them. And then the other one that we get all the time too is, well, what's fun for younger kids has to fundamentally be different than what is fun for older kids. So we looked at this data. And what we found, we'll start first with sex or gender, right? So looking at girls versus boys. Each of these data points here on this X and Y axis graph that you see in front of you are the 81 fun determinants. And so based upon how girls rated it, juxtaposed on the y-axis to how boys rated it, you can see the data points here. And so what you'll notice is we have a very nice, clean, positive linear line here, which means that girls and boys are rating these 81 fun determinants very, very, very similarly. So what is fun for girls, what is most fun for girls, is the same as boys. So another indicator, besides just looking at this graph visually, is to look at the R value that's circled here at the top. That R value is 0.93. The range of that can be negative 0.10 to positive 0.10. So this is a positive linear relationship between girls and boys. And it's a nearly perfect correlation, 0.93. It's quite high. So this is what the data looks like when we look at the similarity between girls and boys. The other driving question is, how is this different for older versus younger players? And you can see here again that the graph, the relationship between younger players and older players is very similar to what we see between girls and boys. And again, that correlation coefficient that you see there at the top is very, very high. So the final question oftentimes is, well, what about high performance or highly select competitive athletes? How does that compare to our recreational community sport athletes? And again, as you might guess, based upon the preceding two graphs, it looks very, very similar, right? So when it comes to fun, and I'm just gonna insert a substitution for that and say when it comes to development, rec players, community sport, athletes are asking for the exact same thing as travel, as highly competitive athletes. And it does not matter whether you're a girl or a boy, or you're younger or older. So what this data is telling us is that universally, young athletes are more similar than they are different in their sport needs when it comes to athlete development. So what I'll leave us with right here are sort of some big take back messaging, right? Based upon the science that we have so far, we know that fun is synonymous with athletic development. We could even argue that it's just a smaller 3-letter word that means athletic development based upon the fun maps and all the 81 determinants. Based upon the data that I just shared with you, young athletes, girls and boys, rec and travel, younger and older, they are universally similar in their fun sport development needs than they are different. Why do we tend to think that they are different? It's because our brains, based upon our culture and expectations and stereotypes, we are programmed to look for and to emphasize differences rather than similarities, right? So girls and boys typically look very different from one another. And so our expectation from a visual standpoint is that they are different and that their fundamental needs are different. But when we look at all the scientific literature, girls and boys, men and women, right, we are more different than we are, we are more similar than we are different, right? And we know this from all the developmental psychology literature, the neuropsychology, it's all the same. And so what science supports is what's called the gender similarity hypothesis, not the gender differences hypothesis. And what I find is that when I go around the world and I give keynotes and I do workshops and clinics, and you have the females in the audience, right? So at sport conferences and things like that, we've all been athletes. And the young girls and the women in the audience, when you show this data to them, you can see on their faces and in their reaction that they finally feel like they have been validated, right? That they want the exact same things as the boys. And that it really is no different. But there are these ways in which our culture programs us to think about anything that's different. And the way that sport is set up, what we find in the literature and the science is anytime we are asked to sort or to categorize things, we do that with the result being that all of these things are very different. And organized sport is set up to fundamentally make us think that athletes are, right? Because we tend to divide young athletes first by their sex, right? Then by what type of league or level of play they're playing in, and by their age. So all of this organization and dividing and sorting of athletes based upon these categories really kind of sets us up to make these cognitive errors in terms of what to expect and what their needs are. And then finally, I would say that words matter, right? Fun is this very small 3-letter word, but it holds such incredible significance for all of us, right? We know when we're having fun, those moment-to-moment experiences that are fun, and we most certainly know when we're not, right? But what the data has shown us so far is that a lot of the myths that we hold about fun and a lot of the misconceptions that we have about what it is, right? That it's goofing off, that it's not being on task, that it's not synonymous with athlete development. In that way, when we use that word fun, that's not congruent with the way that these young athletes have defined for us through the fun maps what fun is, then we tend to then perpetuate these myths and misconceptions about what it is. So one of the things that we can start to do differently in moving forward is think about the ways in which we use this word, and to start to reprogram and rewrite how we use it in a way that is consistent with what the science and what the young athletes have actually told us what fun is. So with that, I will hand it back over to Ryan, and I'm more than happy to take any questions, comments, criticisms, witticisms that anyone may have.
That's great. Thank you. I think I speak for everyone saying this is an excellent insight into your research and what you've done. I've dove into this quite a bit myself, and I'm taking away more pieces and you know, we see emphasizing there. So thank you. First of all, there are a few questions. Just sorry, a correction. This was exceptional. Was the correction come through? A couple questions have come through. If you did want to ask questions, just let me know in the chat box. I can also open up your mic. There is a fear that I may butcher your questions as they come. So first one, so have you compared actions with words in terms of the map? So say a parent says one factor is key, but then they switch teams, coaches, or sports based on another factor.
Wait, can you say that again, Ryan? The last part of the question.
So saying the parents say that one factor is sort of the most important factor that why kids play, but they switch teams or coaches or sports based on another factor. Has that kind of come up in the research? So
that's not something I guess that we've studied specifically in that way. Right. What I can share is that one of the second paper that we published out of this, which again, for anyone that's on here, I'm happy to share these papers or send them to Ryan, and he can send them all out to the rest of you. In that second paper, that was one of our questions as well, right? Is how do we know what the young athletes are saying is most important and least important? What are parents' perceptions of what is most important to fund for their child? And how does that compare to what the coaches are saying as well? And so what we found was that parents actually do a pretty good job of being in tune with what they say is most important for their kid and how their kid actually ranks those 11 fun factors. And then, we looked at that data as well and compared that to the coaches. And so when we looked at the coaches, that R value that I was telling you about related to the graphs that I shared there at the end was significantly lower than it was for the comparison between parents and young athletes. And so what we ended up doing was trying to kind of look at that and tease that out a little bit more. So what we did is we compared young athletes and their coaches to how older athletes and their coaches actually rank those 11 fun factors. And what we found is that the younger athletes and their coaches, that the level of congruity, that R value, was actually quite high. But there was a significant drop in that value between the older players and their coaches. So what essentially that means is that on the older athlete side, right, the young athletes are rating those 11 fun factors in this particular order, and the coaches are saying, no, we think it's in this order, right? So there's a disconnect there with the older coaches and their athletes. And I think part of that, when we look at that data, for example, one of the findings that comes to mind immediately is that young athletes, younger and older, right, they're saying that trying hard, when they do that, when they are doing those 81 or those determinants within that factor, that is highly fun, right? But coaches actually rated it, I believe it was like number 6 out of the 11 fun factors, right? So it just kind of shows the disconnect between where coaches think young athletes or older athletes' fun priorities are. So what that tells us, I think, from a scientific standpoint, is that the way that we looked at that data and we split up the younger kids from the older kids and compared them to their coaches was right around that age of attrition, right? We tend to lose most young athletes between the ages of 9 and 13, right? And the majority of them by that adolescence. And that's how we broke up that data when we looked at it. And so what it's showing us is that now we have some directional indicators on where there's a disconnect when it comes to fun for older adolescent athletes and the sport experiences that are being provided to them.
Right. That's great. Thank you. So, Rusty, I think you had a question there. I can out in the sun lounging, so I'll unmute your mic here. Hopefully we can see.
Thanks everyone, and we've got a day of sunshine in England. Thanks, Amanda. That was great. It reminded me a little bit of Hans Rosling and his TED talk for any economists out there. What I was interested in, and clearly this once again is a self-selecting group because they're curious about your stuff, is like, how do we then translate it to action? Because obviously I've been to Canada, I spent time in England, and the disconnect is vast, quite frankly. And as you said, it gets bigger with age. It probably be interesting to think about like the impact of competition on it. So I think lots of competition starts to influence what adults start to value. And then I guess I was thinking about, to what extent are you thinking about then, and I'm definitely keen to chat to you about it, like create some little activities that people could do at the start of a season as an example, so that the coaches and players and adults, and everyone's just more congruent, so that we can maybe just make this really normal, so kids are having their version of fun. So I don't know whether you've thought about like what comes next after the maps, so that it becomes reality to stop those kids falling out of sport quickly.
Well, I guess I can speak to sort of the trajectory of the science that we're doing right now. So we have the fun maps, right? And we're doing a lot of work actually over in Sweden, in translating those maps into the Swedish language, collecting data around what's most important for Swedish kids, as we've done here in the United States as well. So from a research to practice sort of perspective, the idea then is to basically do an experiment of sorts, and work with coaches and work with programs to develop, or at least to, I guess, modify coaching education and programs in a way that is infused with more coach education around what is fun and around the fun maps, and then mapping sport programs, training sessions, all of these things back into the fun maps. And that being essentially kind of like the experimental group, and then the control group you don't touch, right? They just do things as they always have. And then to measure the sport experiences of young athletes over time, and then to look at retention and dropout relative to that.
Cool. I guess my challenge to that is, and I'm not, lots of the people that you need to influence aren't going on coach education. It's not mandatory over here, for example, to have a coaching qualification. You can still coach. And then also to think, I guess it's time, isn't it? I guess lots of the challenges, like researchy type stuff, takes time, and
it takes time, it takes money, lots of money. To fund it. So I mean, we have a lot of challenges in that respect. I think what you experience over there is really no different than what we experience here in America in terms of, we don't have a sport ministry. Many teams and leagues don't require coaching education. Sport at the youth level is sometimes largely coached and administered by volunteer parents. So that is a sound challenge and question as well. And so I guess my plight is to make the science as digestible, as simple and consumable as possible. And to provide as much dissemination, whether it's through social media and infographics, through the scientific literature, doing webinars, clinics, keynotes, things like that, to provide the knowledge and to create the tools that make it as easy as possible for coaches and parents and leagues to use this research and to adopt it as evidence-informed practice.
Who's doing it well at the moment? Sorry, last question. Who's doing it well? Is there a nation or a sport that you're saying they're killing this? So I could definitely kind of check what they're doing.
I would say this is maybe a biased answer, but based on my experience, I think Sweden has done a phenomenal job at their approach to sport.
Cool.
In part, I think that's part of their culture, but also part of the way in which sport is organized and run over there as well, right? So they have the Swedish Sport Confederation, which is largely funded by the government. They have a smaller population, right, of people. So I think in the whole country, it's around 10 million. So specifically, I know of the work that I've done with the Swedish ice hockey and basketball federations, particularly with ice hockey. A lot of what they have been doing in terms of small-sided games, or on the ice, small surface playing. And they've done a ton of science around that, and they have very specifically been able to define what is the optimal ice size for these training sessions and practices. You know, and that all relates back to the fun maps in terms of how many touches on the puck, right, children are getting, or how many touches on the ball, if it's soccer or rugby or something else. And so what I have found in the work that I've been doing with them over there is that because they're also, they have a different approach to sport, it's much more holistic. They think that fun should drive sport experiences, but that's also a part of their culture and a part of their sport culture, right? Fun and joy is a part of that whole philosophy for them. And because they're a smaller country, when they want to implement change, they're able to do it and to scale things much more easily than we are here in North America.
Thank you.
Yeah, great questions.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Rusty. I'll mute you now so we can't get you back on. There's been another couple questions come through. Also conscious of time as well. So talked about kids and age in your research. So at what age do we start seeing some changes in ranking of importance, or do you feel like this is kind of universal for any age?
So we looked at this lots of different ways, and I'll just go back to the slide here. In the top right-hand corner, we don't really see an age effect.
Right.
Right. So, but that's part of, that's part of the way in which we are in many ways kind of designed to think, right? That what younger kids want and need is fundamentally different than what the older kids want and need. But if you go back to the fun maps, right? And we go back to looking at it in this way here, and we examine what is most important, those top three: trying hard, positive team dynamics, positive coaching. I always kind of bring it down all the way to number 4, learning and improving, because these are so interrelated. When we examine sort of that far left corner there, then I think it's easy for us to wrap our head around the fact that, oh yeah, it makes sense that there wouldn't be a difference between younger kids and older kids here. I wouldn't expect an age effect when I look at these determinants on the left-hand side.
Right. Okay, that's great. And then this question here. So the category on learning and improving.
Yeah.
Have you seen any best practice for people who are either tracking or measuring improvement? And if so, why would you consider them a best practice?
So, that's a great question. I think I don't know of any best practice in terms of measuring these different things. I think that as coaches, many do this informally, right? In terms of kind of, we take cognitive pictures and memories of where different athletes are at and how they've improved. Unless you're doing some type of more specific testing, sort of like maybe at the preseason, mid-season, or even, preseason, start of season, mid-season, postseason would be a way to sort of track these things. Another way is just, informally. I've seen this, and I think it's kind of a cool way to measure it informally. But after, I've seen coaches where after a practice in the locker room or on the sideline, they'll kind of take stock of what the players think, went well, what didn't go well, how much fun did you have, what was the most fun, what did we get better at today, right? and the kids might, come up with individual scores or a grade for themselves. So for kids, a lot of times, they think in terms of grades in school. So an A, B, C, D, or F. And kind of grading themselves in that way is a way to sort of track those different types of things.
Sorry. Sorry, muted there, trying to speak, muted. Happens once every webinar.
Yeah.
Are there any outliers in any of the data that was found in terms of an age group or an experience?
Oh, that's good. That's good. Sounds like there's like another scientist on the call here.
Mm-hmm.
No, not that I don't recall that there was any outlier in this particular data set that was thrown out or omitted in any type of way. I think in this particular data, and what we're finding overseas as well, is that we as humans, the questions that we ask are fundamentally driven by what is different. And what the data is showing us, and particularly in this paper that just came out this month, which again, I'm happy to share. But in that paper, you can see all of I think it's like 27 different ways in which we cut and spliced these kids into different groups to examine how they could be different. And what we found is that they are more similar than they are different.
Okay, we'll go two more questions if
Sure.
you're okay with that.
Yeah.
So just one kind of specifically around the mental bonuses category.
Yeah.
So there's both winning and ignoring the score. Could these be considered opposites, or are they? How is that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and one that I, over all these years have not yet been asked. So kudos to the person who came up with this, because I can see very easily how these might look at in terms of juxtapositions to one another, right? This idea that winning is fun, but ignoring the score is also fun. And I think what's important to understand here, and this is based upon my background and training in sports psychology and being there, in the mix of things as this data was being collected, and being able to ask kids, these follow-up questions and probe at what their experiences are. And when it comes to winning is, if you look at this map again here, there's 81 fun determinants. Winning is one of the 81. It is also the only one on here that is an outcome. Everything else, all 80 of the other fun determinants, are process oriented, right? So yes, winning is fun, right? It's fun at the end of a match to have won that match, right? But when it comes to those moment-to-moment experiences, I think what the young athletes are also saying is not being so focused on the score and being more focused on all of these other, 79 things are more important, right? And part of the way that I break this down for coaches as well, particularly high performance coaches, is that winning is very much an outcome, a goal that we want to achieve, for sure, right? But we don't do that by teaching athletes to be so focused on the score that they're not paying attention and being mindful of what they're doing in the moment, right? Then the score actually becomes distracting. The other is that winning is the outcome, right? So you only you only have sort of a 50-50 shot in team sports of being the winning team or the losing team, right? And what's more important is what young athletes gain out of those experiences, whether they've won or they've lost. And so the other that I very often am brought to is a few years ago when the fun maps first came out and they got a lot of traction in the media, and one was with the Washington Post, and they wanted to do a story on the fun maps, and they wanted to be able to interview some of the players that had actually participated in the studies. And there was one athlete in particular. He had participated over the course of like all 3 or 4 years of the research that we were doing. And he said he was willing to be interviewed. And so he met with the reporter, and the reporter's asking him, you know, tell me about the most fun experience that you have had so far this season. And so he is recounting this one specific game that his team played. And he's going through, you know, at a granular detail, what's happening in this game, how challenging it was, how hard they had to fight, how they had to like be highly cooperative on the field. And it was a really well-matched game. And at the end, the reporter asked him, well, did you lose or did you win? And he said, we lost. But it was absolutely the most fun that I have had playing all season, right? Because it was challenging, because they learned a lot through that game, through that competitive match. And that in and of itself is a bonding experience for athletes as well.
Right, great, thank you. So last question, and I think this may be a $1 million question. In terms of the current, so how do we bring kids back to enjoying the fun on the sports field rather than fun on their phones? Is there?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that is a great question. You know, I think one of the things that children are drawn to at any age on these screens and these various different devices is that there's a level of autonomy, right, that comes with it, whether it's scrolling or it's social media or it's games, you know, that they're playing with their friends on these different platforms. And I think that there's something for all of us in sport to sort of take away from that and to learn from what is capturing their attention and drawing them away from sport or away from being physically active. So one of the things that in the research that we're doing overseas right now in Sweden, and which also sort of comes up in the fun maps as well too, but we've been able to dive a little bit deeper in the focus groups with the kids that we've been doing over there in ice hockey and basketball, is that when it comes to that sense of autonomy, right, part of that autonomy and giving young athletes that autonomy is that we're fundamentally providing for them an opportunity for ownership over their training session, over their, you know, their motivation, the effort that they give. And so one of the ways that the young athletes talk about what they find to be fun in that is when coaches give them the opportunity in training sessions to either come up with and create different drills on their own, or when they're given choices, right? So if it's like, we could do this, that, or the other, and then they get to pick which one they're going to do. But they also talk about this, you know, the opportunity to create within that training session themselves. So I think in sport, we're very part of the tradition behind coaching that has been a mainstay for so long, is that I'm the athlete, you're the coach, you're going to tell me what to do. And then that's how I develop as an athlete. rather than it being more of this guided discovery approach where we align ourselves as coaches, as parents, whatever our adult role is, with the athletes that we're coaching, in being part of that development in a coordinated effort together, right? So I think, you know, as technology has advanced and it provides different things that children are not getting in sport, part of the way in which we keep them in sport is being creative and finding ways to meet their needs in similar ways on the sport field that they're getting met in other places.
That's great, thank you. And I think we've got, so Rusty's up on the screen there. I think he's done quite a wealth of work, good work with the Magic Academy and that. So maybe check out some of that stuff too.
Very cool.
That. Yeah, it's good stuff. So if I didn't get to your question, I apologize. We'll kind of get, I'll get a bank of them, and maybe, Amanda, we could take a couple of them offline, some of the really specific questions. Absolutely. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us and share your research. We know it's a good webinar because we've still got Moff here. He says after an hour people drop off, and he's still here. So that's great stuff. So yeah, thanks, awesome. And thanks for everyone for participating. And Amanda, I'll pass it over to you maybe to do some final words and send us on our way.
Oh gosh, final words. I think I kind of gave them there at the end. Let me see if I can scroll back here very quickly.
I'll put you on the spot. We didn't.
Yeah. No, I think I'll just sort of hit on this idea that words matter. As a sports psychologist and as a sports scientist as well, you know, the words that we use and how we use them have a profound influence. And so I think through all the research that we've done so far and that we're continuing to do, we have a real opportunity here to really reimagine what sport is by reimagining actually what fun is. And we're not left to have to figure that out as sport administrators or as coaches, because the young athletes have already done that for us through the fun maps. And so it's as simple as taking the science and finding the ways that we can infuse it into the practice and in the competition environments that we're creating for young athletes. And, you know, the other way to sort of think about all of the data that's within the fun maps, these 81 fun determinants, is these, I sort of conceptualize them, these are the best practices, right? This is what young athletes are asking for. And fun being synonymous with athlete development, with learning and improving. And so when we lose track of that, we come back to the fun maps and we're reminded of all of these things that help us sort of rewrite how we think about fun in sport.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I'll post this up on our YouTube page and on the Rugby Ontario Development Group as well. So so everyone will have access to this recording as well and share with your community. So thanks very much. And we'll talk to you soon.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks, Ryan.
Bye.
Bye.